It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes with lake breezes or early summer mornings, but the kind that feels heavy, almost wrong. On July 2nd, 1963, the Campbell family disappeared from their lake house near Lake Dunmore in Vermont. Richard Campbell, his wife Margaret, and their two young children Henry and Ruth had arrived only days before for what should have been a restful holiday. The family was well known in town. Richard owned a small accounting firm in Middlebury. Margaret volunteered at the church. The kids went to school just off Main Street. Everyone knew them, or thought they did. That morning they had been seen buying groceries and chatting with neighbors. By the following evening their dock remained still, their lights never came on, and no one answered when the neighbor called. Something about it felt wrong, and when a welfare check was requested, what deputies found would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The front door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed, curtains drawn neatly across the glass. Deputies forced their way in and were struck by an eerie stillness. 4 plates sat on the dinner table, food untouched. Glasses were half full. A record player spun quietly in the living room, the needle scraping endlessly in the final groove. Upstairs, the beds were unmade. A doll lay on its side in the hallway, and a board game sat unfinished by the window. The Campbells were gone. No blood, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. Their car was still parked in the gravel drive. Margaret's purse remained on the counter, her lipstick uncapped beside it. Richard's watch was resting on the bathroom sink. There were no suitcases missing, no packed bags. The scene looked less like a disappearance and more like a life that had simply stopped. Theories swirled almost immediately. Some said the family left in a hurry, others whispered darker things. But nothing about the house suggested panic. Everything appeared placed, paused. Search teams arrived the next morning. Dogs were brought in. The woods were combed. The shoreline was scoured. No footprints were found leading away from the house. No tire marks beyond those of police vehicles. Divers were dispatched to the lake. They found nothing. Richard had no known enemies. Margaret was well liked. The children had never missed school. Detectives ran background checks and examined phone records. Every lead led to silence. The media latched on. Headlines painted the story with phrases like, "Without a trace," and "Vermont's lost family." Within a month, the Campbells' faces were everywhere, but answers were not. Detective George Manley headed the investigation and made weekly statements to the press. Behind closed doors, he began to express doubt. Something about the case didn't fit the patterns he had known. The family's bank accounts had not been touched. Their home in Middlebury remained undisturbed. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. There had been no power outages, no break-ins, no weather events. Nothing that could explain why a family of 4 would vanish with dinner still hot on the table. As the months dragged on and the leads dried up, the case began to slip from headlines. Interest faded. But something had been set in motion that day, something buried beneath that quiet house by the lake. Years passed. The lake house stood untouched, its white paint slowly peeling its porch, sagging under the weight of time. Local kids dared each other to run up and knock on the door. People driving past avoided looking too long. There were stories told around campfires about the ghost family or the lake pulling them under. But for the most part, life moved on. The Campbells became a memory, a town legend. Only a few continued to wonder what really happened. Detective Manley kept the case file in a locked drawer even after his retirement. He once told a reporter in 1966 that he believed someone in that town knew what happened. He just never found out who. Decades later, long after the files had been boxed up and shelved, long after the headlines stopped, a sealed door in the basement of that house would begin to whisper again. Detective George Manley stood at the edge of the Campbell Lake House porch on his 3rd visit that week. The house looked no different than before, but something about it felt off each time he entered. He reviewed the statements taken from locals during the first wave of questioning. Several residents of Middlebury had commented on a noticeable strain between Richard Campbell and his younger brother Thomas, who had moved to Burlington in recent years. Richard had inherited the lake house after their father's death, while Thomas had been left with very little. According to the sheriff's notes from previous years, there had been at least 2 heated confrontations regarding the property. Thomas had reportedly told a bartender at a local tavern that Richard did not deserve it. But investigators could find no record of Thomas being in the area at the time of the disappearance. Even so, the possibility of a dispute gone wrong lingered in the air unresolved and festering beneath the surface. Manley made a note to request another interview with Thomas, though he knew time and distance would only make the truth harder to reach. The bitterness in family matters often went deeper than law could ever prove. Inside the Campbell home, officers cataloged belongings while a team from the state crime lab examined every room. The kitchen showed no fingerprints beyond the family's. The attic contained nothing but old Christmas decorations and suitcases filled with summer clothes. In Margaret's bedside drawer, however, a worn diary surfaced beneath a stack of photographs. The writing was clean, and careful pages filled with reflections on daily life, her children's habits, and occasional thoughts about her marriage. But near the back of the diary, dated just 2 days before the family vanished, Margaret had scribbled a short passage that read more like a confession than a memory. She had written about strange noises coming from the basement during the night. She described waking to faint thumps, dragging sounds, and once hearing a click like a latch closing. She said Richard claimed it was just the old house settling, but she had not believed him. Margaret mentioned that she no longer went downstairs alone. That entry sent a ripple through the investigation team. Until that point, the basement had not raised concerns. Now it became a focal point, a place of possible answers or further questions. Manley ordered the basement re-examined. The cement floor had already been cleared of debris and dusted for prints. Aside from a few dead spiders and shelves holding old tools and canning jars, nothing had stood out. But now the team returned with renewed urgency. Every wall was tapped for hollows. Each beam was checked for tampering. They uncovered a section of paneling along the far wall that appeared newer than the surrounding boards. Manley watched as one of the deputies removed a layer of shelving to reveal a faint outline where something had once been nailed in place. The house had a secret, but it remained just out of reach. With no physical evidence linking the family's disappearance to any suspect, and with no confirmed sign of forced entry or departure, the investigation felt both wide open and paralyzed. Margaret's words became their only hint, and even those were cryptic. The case now hinged on a diary entry and the small-town whispers surrounding a sibling rivalry no one had taken seriously until now. Beyond the investigation itself, the town of Middlebury began to fracture under the weight of speculation. Every rumor was treated like evidence. A former classmate of Richard's claimed he had seen him in a tense conversation with Sheriff Remick just days before the trip to the lake house. The sheriff denied the encounter. Another resident claimed that a red truck had been parked outside the house that weekend, but no one could confirm the detail. Manley was forced to navigate not just the missing persons case, but a growing sense of distrust among the townspeople. Some accused the sheriff of withholding information. Others believed the Campbells had faked their disappearance. But as days turned into weeks, the evidence did not deepen. Instead, it faded. Witnesses began to contradict themselves. The media lost interest. The case remained open but stagnant. Manley continued his interviews, pushing for clarity in the fog of gossip. The truth, if it existed in town, was being guarded with care. Whether out of fear, shame, or guilt, someone knew more than they were saying. By the end of the second month, the official search was scaled back. Volunteers dwindled. The state pulled back their forensic team. Manley remained in charge, but he had less to work with. He continued pursuing the property dispute theory, but Thomas had alibis and no travel records connecting him to the lake house during the disappearance window. The sheriff stood firm on his own position, despite quiet pressure from the town. Margaret's diary was stored as evidence, though the strange sounds she described remained unexplained. The lake was searched again, then again, with divers finding nothing. The Campbell family remained gone. And though law enforcement could not close the file, they could only say so much for so long before it became a story of absence rather than pursuit. Every investigator has a case that follows them through retirement. For George Manley, this would be the one that never stopped knocking. By late 1966, 3 years after the disappearance, Detective George Manley turned in his badge. The Campbell case had not broken him, but it had left a mark that never faded. In his final days at the department, he boxed up the files and carried a copy of the case summary home, unable to leave it entirely behind. When a reporter from the Burlington Gazette requested an interview about the unsolved disappearance, Manley gave only one sentence worth printing. He said that someone in that town was hiding something, and he had spent 3 years trying to figure out who. The town of Middlebury had changed since the Campbell family vanished. The lake house had grown over with weeds and mold. Neighbors no longer spoke openly about the case. Over time, the silence began to feel intentional. Everyone had their theory, but no one had proof. Margaret's diary remained the only real lead, and even that was thin. No suspects had been charged. No bodies had been found. The trail had not just gone cold, it had frozen over completely. Manley retired with the same question he had asked himself every day. How does an entire family disappear without leaving the door open? In 1971, nearly 8 years after the Campbell family vanished, a private buyer expressed interest in purchasing the abandoned lake house. The potential buyer was from out of state, a man with no apparent connection to Middlebury. He filed paperwork through a Boston law firm offering to restore the property and develop the surrounding land for seasonal cabins. But the transaction never went through. A legal technicality emerged that caught everyone off guard. The house had been placed in a dormant trust just months before the disappearance. The trustee of record had died years earlier, and no successor had ever been named. The trust's terms required unanimous consent from all direct heirs before any sale could proceed. With the entire Campbell family still legally classified as missing, the sale was blocked indefinitely. The Boston lawyer withdrew the offer. The property remained under its strange legal shadow, untouched and unmoved. This new detail did little to advance the investigation, but it reignited interest among locals. Why would Richard Campbell, a practical man by all accounts, go through the trouble of shifting the deed into a trust just before his family's summer trip? What had he been protecting, and from whom? As the years continued to pass, the narrative surrounding the Campbell family began to shift. In 1977, a columnist from the Rutland Sentinel published an editorial that stirred long-dormant theories. He suggested that Richard had orchestrated the disappearance himself. According to this theory, Richard had grown overwhelmed by financial stress and had either harmed his family or disappeared with them to escape his obligations. It was a popular idea for readers, but it did not hold up to scrutiny. Investigators had long since reviewed the family's financial records. Richard's accounts were clean. He had no outstanding debts. His firm had been modestly successful with steady income and no unusual withdrawals. Life insurance policies on the family were small and untouched. Travel records showed no bookings. No witness had ever placed Richard outside Vermont after that July weekend. Still, the editorial was picked up by several regional papers. People debated it in coffee shops and barber shops. The idea of a clean-cut family man turning into a runaway criminal was too intriguing to resist, even if the facts did not support it. Manley, now years into retirement, refused to comment when asked. In 1982, the quiet of the lake was broken once again by a strange account from a man named Charlie Greeley. He had drifted into Middlebury the previous spring and spent a few months doing odd jobs around town. Charlie claimed that during a short stint squatting in the Campbell lake house, he had experienced something he could not explain. He told 2 men at a bar that he heard footsteps above him late at night while staying alone in the basement. He said it sounded like someone walking from the kitchen to the living room, then stopping suddenly. When he would go upstairs, he found nothing disturbed. He left after 4 nights and never returned. Weeks later, Charlie abruptly left Middlebury altogether. One of the bartenders who spoke to police said Charlie looked rattled, like a man who had seen something he did not want to remember. His story was impossible to confirm and easy to dismiss, but it stayed with those who heard it. It became another thread in the larger mystery. A man passing through claiming to hear footsteps in a house that had been silent for nearly 20 years. By the late 1980s, the Campbell Lake House had become a place of quiet dread among the locals. Children who had grown up hearing stories about the missing family now had children of their own, and the legend of the house by Lake Dunmore persisted like a shadow that never moved. The house stood in decay, its once white siding now gray with mildew and time. The wooden steps sagged, and ivy had claimed most of the side porch. High schoolers dared each other to sneak inside after dark, but most never made it past the driveway. People claimed they saw lights flicker in the upstairs window, but no power had run through the house since the mid-70s. One fall afternoon, a retired schoolteacher named Madeline Grant gave an interview to a regional documentary crew filming a piece on Vermont's unsolved mysteries. She recalled seeing Margaret at a church bazaar just days before the family's disappearance. Madeline remembered Margaret seemed on edge, distracted, as if she was listening for something no one else could hear. Madeline mentioned that Margaret had asked if the church basement doors still locked from the outside. It was a detail she had never reported, unsure it meant anything at the time. The interview never aired, but the production crew's footage circulated among local history groups and eventually found its way to a small public access channel. The mention of the basement door reignited conversation among those still curious about the case. A town archivist named Gordon Lane dug through old maintenance records from the church and confirmed that during the early 60s, the basement doors were indeed fitted with external locks after a series of petty thefts. What no one could answer was why Margaret would care. The question lingered in town meetings and coffee shops, another piece of an already jagged puzzle. Around this same time, a local man named Stuart Rowe wrote a short piece in the Middlebury Town Review. In it, he claimed his father once saw Richard Campbell in a shouting match with the town sheriff 3 days before the disappearance. Stuart admitted his father never told anyone officially believing it was just a personal dispute. No one could confirm the story, but once again the whispers grew louder. Why would a man like Richard be seen arguing publicly with the sheriff, and why had this information stayed hidden for nearly 25 years? That same fall, the Historical Society was given access to several sealed boxes from the estate of a deceased attorney who had once handled land transactions in the county. Among the boxes was a folder marked with the Campbell family name. Inside were standard documents about the property, and a list of items submitted during the transfer into the trust. Tucked behind one manila folder was an envelope containing 3 undeveloped rolls of camera film. The film canisters had names scrawled on the labels, likely belonging to the Campbell children. The archivist alerted local authorities, and with care, the film was developed by a lab specializing in aged materials. Most of the photos were expected. The family appeared happy. The children were smiling. Margaret was usually behind the camera. One photo stood out. It showed the children playing in the yard with the tree line just behind them. Toward the edge of the frame, partly obscured by shadows and blur, stood a man. He was facing away from the camera, his shoulders squared and his head tilted as if listening. His figure did not match Richard's frame or height. He wore a long coat despite the summer heat. No one recognized him. The image did not provide answers, but it shifted the story once more. For years, speculation had pointed inward toward the family or the town. Now there was a new possibility. Someone had been watching. Carol Briggs, a local librarian who had long kept a box of news clippings about the case, began circulating the photo among elderly residents in hopes of identifying the man. Some claimed it might have been a groundskeeper or an old tenant from years prior, but nothing was confirmed. What unsettled people most was not the figure itself, but the way he seemed unaware of the camera, yet present enough to be caught in that moment. Margaret would have developed the photos had she returned home, but she never did. The rolls sat hidden in an envelope behind legal forms for more than 3 decades. That they resurfaced at all felt like something deliberate. And in a town still haunted by a door that led nowhere, the blurred image of a stranger watching from the woods was enough to start the whispers all over again. In the spring of 1997, a woman named Carol Hines received a letter from a law firm in Burlington. The envelope was official, but plain, marked with a name she did not recognize. Inside was a notice informing her of an unexpected inheritance. Her grandmother, Ruth Lyman, had passed away earlier that year. Carol had already attended the small funeral and had not expected further communication. The letter explained that Ruth's estate had included a dormant property held under a decades-old trust. As the last living heir named in the trust's documents, Carol now owned a parcel of land near Lake Dunmore. She had never heard of the place. She had grown up in Montpelier and had never been to Middlebury. Still, curiosity overcame hesitation. A week later, she drove down to view the property. The road was narrow and framed with tall pines. When she arrived, she saw a house that looked like it had fallen asleep long ago. The paint was peeling, the windows coated in grime, and the porch looked unstable. Carol walked through the front door slowly. She felt as though she had stepped into someone else's memory, one not her own, yet strangely familiar in a way she could not explain. Carol moved carefully through each room. The air was stale, heavy with dust and mold. Broken tiles crunched beneath her boots. Sunlight pushed through the curtains in thin strips. A few old chairs remained in the living room. The wallpaper had peeled away in spots, revealing the cracked plaster underneath. In the upstairs bedroom, she found a photograph resting on a dresser. The faces were faded, but still clear enough. A man, a woman, and 2 children stood near a dock. Carol did not recognize any of them, but something in her chest tightened. She slipped the photograph into her coat pocket and walked down the narrow staircase toward the kitchen. It was there, while inspecting the loose floorboards near the pantry, that she noticed a faint bulge under one of the planks. Curious, she pried it loose with a kitchen knife she found in a drawer. Beneath it, wrapped in a brittle cloth, was a folded piece of construction paper, covered in crayon marks. It appeared to be a child's drawing. 2 stick figures stood side by side. One was labeled me in shaky handwriting. The other figure was larger, shaded in black, and labeled the man downstairs. Carol sat on the floor and stared at the drawing for several minutes. She did not understand what she was looking at, but the childlike simplicity made it all the more haunting. She placed the drawing inside a book she had brought with her, then continued exploring. In the basement, the smell grew stronger. Dampness and rot clung to the concrete. The foundation walls were streaked with moisture and mold. While inspecting the shelves lining one wall, Carol noticed something strange. The far wall did not match the rest of the basement. The cement there was smoother, newer. She tapped it with her knuckles. It echoed in a way that suggested a hollow space behind it. She stepped back and examined the pattern. A wooden cabinet covered part of the wall, and with great effort she pulled it away. Behind it, barely visible, was an outline in the cement. It looked like a door frame that had been sealed shut. Along the edges, rusted bolts lined a faint wooden seam. 6 bolts in total, all caked in grime and corrosion. The door was real, and it had been deliberately hidden. Carol stood frozen. Her breath felt shallow, and the drawing in her pocket grew heavier somehow. She left the house that evening without touching the sealed door. Instead, she returned to Montpelier and began researching everything she could about the property. Her search brought up news clippings, headlines she had never seen before. The Campbell disappearance, the lake house, the mystery that had never been solved. She found old articles scanned into archives, including one with a photograph of the family. It was the same photograph she had found upstairs. For the next week, Carol slept poorly. She kept thinking about the drawing. She eventually contacted a contractor and asked for help with a possible structural anomaly in an old basement. She did not mention the door or the name Campbell. The contractor agreed to meet her the following Saturday. When he arrived and examined the wall, he confirmed that it had been sealed intentionally. With Carol's permission, he began working carefully, removing the bolts, one at a time. When the final bolt dropped to the floor, the air shifted. A faint odor escaped through the opening. The contractor pried the wooden door open just enough to shine his flashlight inside. He stepped back and looked at Carol with a face drained of color. Carol stood just outside the opening, watching as the contractor stepped away from the dark space. The room beyond the door was small and windowless, about the size of a garden shed. Its walls were lined with rough concrete, stained in places by time and moisture. The smell inside was thick and sour, something between mold and old smoke. A broken light bulb hung from a rusted chain in the center of the ceiling. Its glass was cracked, the filament long dead. Against the far wall sat a rusted metal chair. The chair faced the door, positioned as if someone had been watching and waiting. The floor below it was blackened, with a large, uneven burn mark that stretched several feet in diameter. Carol covered her nose and mouth with her sleeve. Neither she nor the contractor said much as they examined the room. There was no window, no vent, no second exit. The door itself was solid wood thick and reinforced with iron brackets. Whoever had sealed it had meant for it to stay closed. Carol asked the contractor to take photos and measurements. She wanted to document everything, even though she could barely stand to look at the chair too long. Later that day, after the contractor left, Carol remained at the house. She walked through the upstairs rooms with a different awareness now. Every creak of the floorboards felt louder. Every shadow seemed to move slightly out of place. She returned to the basement and stood just outside the chamber, not stepping inside. The space felt wrong, not just because of what it held, but because of what it suggested. Someone had used that room for something, and they had wanted it forgotten. The drawing she had found weeks earlier now took on a darker meaning. The figure labeled the man downstairs had not been just a child's fantasy. It had been a memory captured in crayons by a frightened hand. Carol sat at the kitchen table and tried to piece together what she knew. The Campbell family had vanished in 1963. The house had remained untouched for decades. No remains had ever been found, but that burn mark in the floor and the sealed door suggested that something terrible had happened beneath this house. She knew she needed help beyond contractors and curiosity. She contacted the Middlebury Police Department and asked to speak with someone about a potential discovery related to a cold case. Detective Ron Langley met her at the house 2 days later. He was a quiet man in his 50s with gray at his temples and a polite skepticism in his voice. Carol walked him through what she had found. She showed him the drawing, the photograph, and the chamber in the basement. Langley listened carefully, asked precise questions, and took his own photos. He radioed for backup and requested the department's forensic unit to join them the following morning. Carol stayed at a hotel that night, unable to sleep. She stared at the ceiling for hours, her mind cycling through images she could not forget. The next morning, the forensic team arrived with equipment lights and protective suits. They documented the scene inch by inch. Using special tools, they examined the burn mark and collected samples from the floor. The technician in charge confirmed that there were signs of combustion consistent with organic material. The team also recovered what appeared to be fragments embedded in the concrete. The technician said they would need lab confirmation, but believed the material could be bone. Carol stood in the hallway watching as years of silence finally began to give way to something real. As the team worked, Langley reviewed the original case files comparing the current findings with the historical reports. He noted the diary entry from Margaret mentioning noises in the basement. He also found an early note from the first detective, George Manley, stating that the basement had shown nothing unusual at the time. It was now clear that something had been missed. Langley spoke with Carol again and asked more about her connection to the house. She explained that she had inherited it from her grandmother, Ruth Lyman, but did not know how Ruth had come to possess it. That detail puzzled Langley. He made a call to a retired court clerk and requested probate records from the 1960s and 1970s. Meanwhile, the forensic team began examining the chair and discovered what looked like human hair snagged in a rusted weld. A partial footprint was found near the threshold of the chamber. It had been preserved beneath dust and time, and the technician said it might still hold value if compared with old evidence. Langley knew then that the Campbell case was no longer a mystery locked in rumor. The house had kept a secret, and the cellar door had finally begun to speak. As news of the basement discovery began to circulate through Middlebury, the town stirred in a way it had not in decades. People who had long buried their memories of the Campbell family found themselves speaking in hushed tones once more. Carol received visits from older residents who remembered the summer of 1963 with painful clarity. One afternoon, a man named Gerald Knowles came to the house uninvited. He stood on the porch holding his cap in his hands. Gerald had been a neighbor back then, just 17, when the Campbells vanished. He told Carol he had kept something to himself for a long time and needed to say it now. He remembered seeing Richard Campbell standing at the edge of the lake one morning arguing with someone in uniform. Gerald watched from a distance and believed the man had been the town sheriff. At the time, he assumed it was over a permit or something minor. But now, decades later, with everything Carol had found, it no longer felt minor. Gerald never reported it because no one asked him, and he had not been sure it mattered. Now he believed that argument had taken place just 2 days before the family disappeared. Carol shared the story with Detective Langley, who added the statement to the growing file. The original sheriff, Donal Remick, had passed away years ago, but his name now returned to the center of attention. Langley began looking into the old sheriff's connections, requesting archived reports and personnel files. The investigation was beginning to unearth names that had faded with time. Meanwhile, Carol continued cleaning the attic. One morning, while sorting through boxes of magazines and brittle holiday decorations, she found a small crate pushed behind an old wardrobe. Inside were 3 metal film canisters, their labels nearly worn away. Carol recognized the type from photography classes she had taken years before. She brought the film to a local photo lab that specialized in restoring old negatives. It took nearly a week for the images to come back. Most of the pictures were as expected. The Campbell children played in the yard Richard read on the porch, and Margaret stood near the lake with a camera in hand. But one image stopped Carol cold. In it, the children were by the tree line laughing. A man stood a few yards behind them just at the edge of the woods. He was facing away from the camera, his posture stiff. Carol brought the photo directly to Langley. He examined it with care and asked if anyone had ever identified the man. She said she had shown it to a few locals months before, but no one recognized him with certainty. Langley had the photo scanned and enhanced. The figure was not clear enough to make out facial features, but the outline of his coat and the curve of his shoulders suggested someone older and stockier than Richard Campbell. The man's position in the photo was unsettling. He did not appear to be part of the scene, but instead a separate presence. When Langley shared the photo with his department, one of the younger officers asked if anyone had checked school records or park rangers from that period. Langley ordered a full review of any public employees working near Lake Dunmore in 1963. Simultaneously, the forensic team updated their findings. The bone fragments found in the burn mark belonged to at least 3 individuals. DNA analysis confirmed that 2 matched profiles of Margaret Campbell and her daughter Ruth. The 3rd sample was badly damaged, but believed to be Henry. Richard's DNA was not found in the chamber. The absence of Richard's remains shifted the investigation again. If he was not among the victims, then the questions about his role in the event returned with new weight. Langley reviewed Richard's financial records again, looking for recent activity that might have been overlooked. Nothing surfaced. However, buried in an evidence box from 1963 was a pair of worn leather boots. They had been found in the trunk of Richard's car, which had been impounded after the disappearance. At the time, no one had considered them significant. Langley requested a forensic comparison between the boot treads and the partial footprint found near the cellar threshold. The results came back in 2 days. The impression matched. The boot had been present in that room at some point. Whether it had belonged to Richard or been planted later was unclear. The evidence was circumstantial but powerful. Carol felt a shift in the tone of the investigation. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to align. And with each new photo and statement, the story of what happened that summer deepened into something darker than she had imagined. Detective Ron Langley sat at his desk late one evening, surrounded by documents and photographs. The Campbell case had overtaken every other assignment on his schedule. He had reviewed every report, every witness statement, and every photograph taken in 1963. But one lead continued to bother him. George Manley, the original lead investigator, had been meticulous in his documentation, yet something about his notes felt incomplete. Langley contacted the police department's Retired Officers Association and asked for contact information for Manley's family. He was told that Manley had passed away in 1989, but that his daughter Ellen still lived in Rutland. Langley called her and asked if she would be willing to talk about her father's old case. Ellen agreed, although she admitted she knew little about the investigation. Langley drove out to meet her on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She welcomed him into a modest brick home filled with family photographs and shelves of worn books. Ellen mentioned that after her father died, she had found a locked wooden box among his belongings. It had been marked with a strip of tape labeled Campbell Case Do Not Destroy. She had kept it sealed for years, unsure whether to open it. That day she handed it to Langley without hesitation. Langley brought the box back to his office and carefully removed its contents. Inside were handwritten notes, old photographs, and one sealed envelope addressed to Margaret's sister, Elaine Harmon. The envelope had never been mailed. Langley unfolded the letter and read its contents with growing unease. Margaret had written the letter in July 1963, just 3 days before the family vanished. In it, she described her deepening concern about Richard's behavior. She wrote that he had become distant quiet and easily agitated. He had stopped sleeping and often wandered the house at night. Margaret mentioned the noises from the basement and how Richard would brush them off without explanation. She wrote that he had started locking the basement door at night and that the children were not allowed downstairs. Margaret closed the letter by saying she no longer felt safe in the house and was considering taking the children back to Middlebury early. The letter, folded and stained at the edges, offered the clearest view yet into the fear Margaret had lived with during those final days. Langley knew this letter should have been part of the original file. For some reason, Manley had chosen to keep it separate. Along with the letter, the box contained a roll of crime scene photographs never included in the department's archive. These were personal copies, likely developed by Manley himself. Langley spread them out across his desk and examined each one. Most showed the same rooms already documented in official records. But one photograph stood out. It had been taken from the top of the basement stairs, angled just enough to capture the far wall. Even in the black and white image, the faint outline of the sealed chamber could be seen. At the time, it had been dismissed as part of the foundation. Now Langley realized that Manley had noticed it too. Perhaps he had intended to pursue it, but was pulled away from the case before he could. Or perhaps he had suspected something he could not prove, and kept the image for his own records. Either way, the presence of that door in the photograph confirmed that the chamber had existed from the start. It had not been added later. Langley added the image to the official evidence file and scanned it into the case system. Each detail brought the past closer to the surface. Langley met with Carol again that weekend and shared the contents of the letter and the photographs. Carol listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She asked if Margaret had ever sent other letters to her sister and whether Elaine Harmon was still living. Langley promised to follow up. That afternoon, he tracked down public records confirming that Elaine had moved to New Hampshire in the late 70s. She had passed away in 1991, leaving no children. Langley drove out to her former home and spoke with the current owner, who had a few boxes left behind in the attic. Inside one was a collection of family letters and photographs. Among them were several postcards from Margaret Campbell, written before the disappearance. They spoke of the lake, the children, and the quiet summer days. But one postcard dated June 28, 1963, mentioned a visitor. Margaret had written that Richard's brother Thomas had called unexpectedly and was planning to stop by the lake house. The postcard ended abruptly, the handwriting slightly smudged. This detail had not appeared in any of the original reports. Langley now had a new timeline to work with: Margaret's fear, Richard's behavior, and an unannounced visit from a brother with a known grievance. The state forensic team returned to the lake house with new equipment and a clear objective. With the confirmation of human remains inside the sealed chamber, and the recent revelations from the investigators' box, authorities sought to re-examine the entire basement. The burned area on the floor had already yielded fragments of bone, but now forensic experts used ground-penetrating radar to assess whether more evidence was buried beneath the concrete. After several passes, they marked 2 areas with possible irregularities. The decision was made to carefully break the surface in those spots. What they found were additional bone fragments and what appeared to be the rusted remains of a small, metallic object. Forensic anthropologists spent the next several days examining and cataloging each item. DNA results were expedited. Within 2 weeks, the lab confirmed that the additional fragments also matched the profiles of Margaret Campbell and her daughter Ruth. The damage to the remains suggested exposure to intense heat, followed by time and compression beneath the concrete. The third profile, believed to be the younger son, Henry, remained too degraded to confirm, but was consistent with his age and sex. The fourth set of remains, the one person still unaccounted for, was never found. Detective Langley and his team turned their attention to the question that had been looming for weeks. Where was Richard Campbell? If his wife and children had died in that basement, and if his boots had left a print near the chamber, why was his body not among them? The theories had shifted back and forth. Some believed Richard had harmed his family in a moment of madness or under pressure from financial stress. Others pointed to the diary and the sealed letter as signs that Margaret feared him. But Langley found it difficult to accept that version entirely. Richard's journals, which had been recovered from a locked desk drawer in the upstairs study, painted a more complicated picture. He wrote often about his brother Thomas and the strain between them. He described Thomas's resentment and mentioned that they had argued about the lake house multiple times over the phone. One entry from late June stated that Thomas had threatened to come and take what was his. The journal ended abruptly on July 3, 1963. There were no entries for the day of the disappearance. Langley ordered a full background check on Thomas Campbell, who had been living in upstate New York in the years after 1963. Investigators traveled to Thomas's last known address, only to find that he had died in 1985 from a reported heart condition. With no direct testimony available, they turned to his estate and began contacting people who had known him. One former co-worker mentioned that Thomas never spoke of his brother, but recalled that he once burned several boxes of old family papers after a night of heavy drinking. Another neighbor said Thomas had panic attacks whenever he heard the sound of a record player. These fragments painted a portrait of a man carrying something heavy. Langley requested access to Thomas's financial records from the 1960s and made a quiet discovery. On July 10, 1963, 1 week after the Campbells vanished, a large cash withdrawal had been made from Thomas's account. He had never been wealthy, and the amount stood out as unusual. It was never deposited elsewhere and was not used to purchase property. Langley suspected it may have been a payoff or part of a transaction related to what happened at the lake house. Still without physical evidence or a confession, it remained circumstantial. But each thread brought them closer to understanding the weight of the truth buried under years of silence. As the investigation reached deeper into the history of the Campbell family, new light was shed on an overlooked piece of evidence. In 1963, Richard's car had been impounded and stored in a police facility. It had remained there in long-term evidence storage untouched. Langley arranged for the vehicle to be reopened and thoroughly examined with modern techniques. Inside the trunk, wrapped in an old tarp, was a second pair of boots, a rusted crowbar, and a small stained notebook. The boots were consistent in size and wear with the ones found earlier, but the crowbar and notebook added something unexpected. The notebook, though water-damaged, held several pages still legible. It was not Richard's handwriting. The entries were brief and fragmented. One entry read, "He knows about the door." Another said, "I saw her near the stairs." The final entry read, "I tried to stop him." Langley believed the notebook may have belonged to Thomas or another unknown person involved. Forensic handwriting analysts could not confirm authorship, but the tone of the entries suggested a third party who had witnessed or participated in the events. With every page, the mystery sharpened. Someone else had been there that night, and someone had failed to stop what happened. Autumn arrived slowly over Lake Dunmore, brushing the treetops in gold and rust. The Campbell house sat quiet as it had for decades, but this time there was movement within. Carol stood in the upstairs bedroom, holding the old photograph of the family she had never known. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a pale sun. The investigation had reached its final stages, yet the questions remained heavy. No arrests had been made. No surviving suspect had been found. Still, the truth had shifted from theory into clarity. Margaret and her children had died in that basement, most likely at the hands of someone who knew them well. The evidence pointed toward confrontation, perhaps even a plan, but no witness remained alive to confirm. Thomas Campbell had taken whatever he knew to the grave. The notebook and the cash withdrawal suggested guilt. The crowbar found in the trunk, stained and wrapped, suggested violence. But Richard's absence remained the deepest wound. Carol had come here with no expectations. She only wanted to understand why her name had been linked to this house. She never imagined uncovering the final traces of a family swallowed by silence. And yet she had brought them back into the light. A week before Thanksgiving, Carol received a small envelope in her mailbox. The stamp had been postmarked from a town in Maine. There was no return address. Inside the envelope was a single brass key and a folded note written in shaky handwriting. The note read, "Some things are too heavy to carry. I am sorry." The key was old tarnished and engraved with the initials FNB. Detective Langley identified it as belonging to a safety deposit box from First National Bank, a regional chain with several closed branches in New England. They traced the box to a location in Brattleboro, Vermont. With a court order and bank approval, Carol and Langley opened the box together. Inside was a leather-bound journal wrapped in a faded flannel cloth. The pages inside had been filled carefully in ink. The name Richard Campbell was written on the inside cover. Carol felt her breath catch as she held the book in her hands. For years his name had been spoken only as a shadow. Now his voice was here. Langley asked if she wanted to read it alone. She nodded. He stepped outside, and she sat at the small table inside the bank office and opened to the first page. The journal entries began 2 days before the family disappeared. Richard wrote of tension in the house and Margaret's fear. He acknowledged that something had shifted between him and his brother, and that he no longer trusted Thomas near the children. He wrote that Margaret wanted to leave early, but he asked her to stay so he could resolve matters in person. On the day of the disappearance, Richard described Thomas arriving in a state of agitation. The confrontation escalated quickly. The next several pages were smudged, as if written under great distress. Richard wrote that Thomas pushed Margaret during an argument, and that she struck her head on the basement steps. The children screamed. Richard wrote that he tried to stop Thomas but was overpowered. The entries that followed were brief and scattered. He described sealing the door to keep the memory contained. He wrote that he stayed at the lake for days after unsure of what to do, unable to leave them behind, but too broken to face the world. He said he never ran from justice. He simply chose to disappear in place. His final entry read, "I was supposed to protect them from him. I failed. I locked it away. I never left the lake." Carol sat motionless for a long time after finishing the final page. She felt sorrow for Margaret and the children for the lives stolen and silenced. She felt anger at the choices Richard made, choices born of panic or guilt or something harder to name. But more than anything, she felt the weight of a story that had finally been told. It had waited in photographs, in footprints, in walls built not of brick, but of memory. The house had carried that burden room by room until someone came willing to listen. Carol decided not to keep the journal. She returned it to Langley and asked that it be placed in the case archive. She wanted it to remain as part of the record, not a personal keepsake. The lake house would soon pass into new ownership. The town had voted to preserve the land as part of a historical trust. The house would not be demolished, but instead stabilized and opened for educational visits. The decision sparked debate, but for Carol, it felt right. The Campbells would not be forgotten. Their story would live not as rumor, but as remembrance. On her last visit to the property, Carol walked alone through the tall grass leading to the water's edge. The sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the lake. She thought of Ruth and Henry playing by the shore. She imagined Margaret standing near the window watching them. Carol stood at the dock and looked out at the still surface of the water. She did not cry. She only breathed in the cold air and let the silence speak. Behind her the house stood unchanged in shape, but transformed in meaning. It was no longer a place of fear. It had become a vessel of truth. Carol turned back toward the path and walked away without looking behind her. Some answers come quietly. Some names are spoken again, not with dread, but with dignity. In finding them, she had found part of herself. Not through blood or inheritance, but through compassion. She had given voice to those who had none. In doing so, she had shown what it means to listen to the walls when they whisper. Not every secret wants to be kept. Not every silence means peace. Some silences are wounds that wait for someone willing to hear. She had heard. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries. We would love to hear what you think about the plot and the twists along the way. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most.